At one point, the alligator skin trade had the gators in Florida down to a meager 100. Trappers and traders made a killing, so to speak, off the booming trade. When their numbers became critically low and heavy fines and laws were placed around hunting them, the trade almost stopped completely. Yes, the gators were saved, but the efforts were more successful than anyone could have predicted. Today, Florida has well over 1 million alligators in its waters, and with that huge jump in numbers comes a huge jump in the number of attacks recorded around the Everglades, too. The area around Lakeland Canal in Florida is huge, with plenty of hidey holes for criminals to do their deals in private, and even more places for teenagers to go to do some underage drinking without being discovered. Florida is a wild place, both for the animals and the crowd of people looking for a good time. The 17th of May, 2008, was a Saturday, and a group of teenagers and college students had congregated in one of those secluded places we just mentioned. It started off innocently enough, a group of around 20 kids hanging around a small pond in the afternoon with illegally bought booze. They had inflated tubes, and the party was still going strong by the time the sun started to go down. The pretty girls and plenty of free drinks brought in dozens of other kids. By the time the evening had settled in completely, the group had swelled to more than 50. The cars supplied plenty of light, and someone even had a pretty good sound system in his car, playing the hits of the day. Just a little after 9 p.m., the party was in full swing. If you asked any of the youngsters there that day how many of the partygoers they were actually acquainted with, they would tell you that they didn't know half of the people there, and a lot of them weren't in much of a state to tell who anyone was anymore anyway. There was one young man in the crowd that no one really took notice of. He was around 21, and he'd hopped in a car with a group of young men he just met at a bar a few hours ago with the promise of a party and some pretty girls. One moment they were chatting over the counter, and the next he was at a pond where he didn't know anyone. The 3 college students that had given him a ride hadn't even bothered to catch his name. But that was all right. He didn't know their names either. The unnamed young man didn't stand out since many of the kids weren't acquainted with each other before that day, and he talked comfortably with almost everyone at some point or another during the evening. He moved between the groups of friends clustered together, making small talk for a few minutes before moving on to the next group. Like all young people seemed to do so comfortably, the conversation flowed easily between strangers, and even if they didn't know someone before that day, you made friends fast enough over football teams and pop culture. Somewhere, the young always seem to find common ground when they're thrown together. Katy Perry's I Kissed a Girl just ended, and it switched over to Leona Lewis's Bleeding Love, when the laughter and music were interrupted by the telltale wail of a police siren. In a matter of seconds, before the patrol car headlights even fell on the scene, the music winked into silence. Bodies practically trampled over each other, and hordes of kids piled themselves into the nearest vehicle they could reach. The cars dispersed like a huddle of raccoons caught in the trash can. They just scattered into the night. The cops were lucky enough to pull over 2 cars, one of which had 8 people crammed into it. 12 of the more than 50 partygoers slept in jail cells that night until their parents could come and bail them out the next morning. But that unnamed man was not lucky enough to make it into one of the cars. When the sirens went off and the party dispersed, he was on the farthest side of the clearing. He'd just come back after relieving himself behind some bushes nearby, and it was quicker and safer to just jump behind the nearest tree than it was to run all the way across the clearing. He was never going to make it all the way to the nearest car before the cops arrived, so he decided to hide instead. But with only the dim light of the fire, he misjudged his step completely and crashed into the pond. With all of the stomping feet, the sirens, and the general chaos of the moment, no one took notice of the startled yelp he let out or the sound of the splash as he hit the water. It wasn't deep, just cold and muddy. He came up almost as soon as he went under, but he didn't move from the cold pond. Instead, he lay deathly still, hidden from sight by reeds and bushes. 2 police officers jumped out of the patrol car and rounded up the kids in the 2 cars that were too slow to make it out. Another patrol car raced off, hoping to catch some of the other teenagers that were fast enough to hit the dirt road. If it had still been light out, the officers would have easily spotted the young man, soaked to the bone, hiding in the shallow water. But the darkness kept him well hidden as long as he lay very, very quietly. Unbeknownst to him, there was another danger just behind him, and this one did not come with handcuffs and a gun. This one had scales and teeth. A 7-foot alligator had been stalking the pond almost all afternoon. Initially, she had her sights set on waiting for one of the partygoers to venture into the water alone, but they kept coming in to cool off in groups of 3 and 4. She had her teeth and immense strength, but she wasn't much bigger than the humans. She knew full well that she wouldn't get away with a kill if she had to fight off several of them at once. When the night came, the humans stopped going into the water, and she was just about to leave, giving up her chances of catching anything that day. But in that moment, the police arrived, and the young man fell into the water. She observed that he wasn't moving, so she inched a little closer. But there was so much movement on the banks that she was very careful to make her approach. By the time the teenagers were rounded up and the officers had them lined up and waiting for backup to arrive, she was only 4 feet away from him. She could smell the mammalian heat radiating from his body, and she had to fight all of her instincts to not jump on him right then and there. After waiting so long, she needed to approach this hunt just right if she wanted to eat at all that day. Quietly, the lad lay and watched as 2 more cars pulled up and marched the miserable teenagers into the back seats, cramming them in like sardines in a can, and even more quietly behind him, the stalker closed in even more. The gator was only 2 feet away from him now. The cars backed out, and before their headlights had even disappeared completely, the man pushed himself up from his stomach, gearing to get out of the pond. That's when the animal struck. When she saw that the boy was about to get up and out of her hunting ground, she sank her teeth into his leg, pulling him in the moment she had him in her grasp. It came out of nowhere. With his eyes on the receding patrol cars and his knees under him already, the man had no warning, no inkling of what was coming. He just felt the sharp pain suddenly shooting through his leg, and the enormous heave that threw his face down into the 3-inch water. He kicked out his free leg, screaming bloody murder into the night, and felt his foot connect with something hard. That's when the reality of the situation hit him. This was an alligator, and it was pulling him away from the bank. If the drunk teenagers in the back of the patrol cars weren't bickering and yelling at each other, someone might have heard him scream. The man kicked and wiggled his body desperately, but it was no use. The creature had him away from the bank and in the open water in a matter of seconds. In that moment of panic, all traces of inebriation left him. He kicked, screamed, and swallowed pond muck, fighting the brute strength of the animal that had him in its grasp. The teeth tore through his jeans and ripped through the muscle and skin beneath the fabric. But the man no longer had any ground beneath him, just empty water. This is where the predator was most comfortable, in the deep. Instinctually, she whipped her tail and body around him, spinning as she went. She was so fast that she created a whirlpool as they descended into the dark. The young man was wound so tight that his collarbones smashed into each other. Now completely entwined and fully submerged, there was no longer any way to fight the beast. His arms were pinned to his sides, and his free leg kicked feebly as the world around him spun at dizzying speeds. Even if she didn't have him by the leg, the death roll itself was enough to incapacitate him completely. It didn't take long for the young man to sink into unconsciousness. Lack of air was only part of it. The animal's body, coiled around him, was so tight that it cut off circulation. There was no oxygen coming in from his lungs or his blood. His brain was deprived of oxygen in mere seconds. He was as good as dead the moment she had him in the open water. When he went still, the alligator unwound her reptilian hold on him. Without letting go of his leg, she swam him off into the connecting stream that fed into the pond, the place she decided to stow him so that she could feed in peace. Before the morning came, no less than 4 other alligators were attracted by the smell of blood, and it didn't take them long to find them. For hours, she fought the scavengers away from her kill, and not all that successfully. The first loss was the man's shredded leg, grabbed up by a smaller gator when her attention was on another. She fought off the one that had her occupied, but it was too late to stop the thief from getting away with the leg. She did manage to get the whole leg that was still attached herself, but only just in time before 2 more gators showed up. These ones were much larger than she was, and they shoved her out of the way to grab what limbs they could reach. In a grotesque tug-of-war, each gator had an arm in its mouth. It didn't take them long to each get away with a piece. Luckily, they were happy with the arms they got, and they disappeared into the early morning light with their stolen breakfast. And there, on that riverbank, is where 2 fishermen found the gator later that morning, still fighting away a small congregation of younger alligators that collected around her. The authorities were there within minutes of receiving the call, but it wasn't going to be a simple extraction. The female was maddened by anger. Her kill had been repeatedly snatched up piece by piece, and by now, she'd been fighting for almost 12 hours. She was out of her mind with rage. No amount of noise could chase her away from the corpse, and she snapped and stormed at anyone and any boat that dared approach her. It took 3 shots to kill the enraged animal, and several more to disperse the collection of alligators that milled around the area. At the end of the day, 4 gators were dragged out, the female among them, but only she had any remains inside her stomach. The other 3 weren't lucky enough to get away with a scrap. This posed a huge problem for the authorities. The young man had no arms, and therefore no fingerprints that could be extracted from the remains. His head was still intact, but barely. The night's fight, with several animals involved, had left such a ruined mess behind that he was no longer recognizable by his facial features. The rest of his remains, too, were scratched, torn, and ripped. So even if he'd had any tattoos, they were now no longer identifiable. The only thing they could do was take DNA from his teeth and hair and put it in storage. And that's where those samples are to this day, gathering dust at the back of a storage facility almost 20 years later. John Doe was never identified. No one knows where he came from or who his family were. And after so many years, it's unlikely that we'll be able to put a name on the unmarked grave that stands in a graveyard in Florida. His identity will forever be a mystery, unlike the story of his terrifying final affliction.